Hello, everyone, and welcome to episode 100 of A Week in Watches. Yeah, I can't quite believe we've shot 100 of these either, but a little number at the beginning of the episode doesn't lie. This little show of ours started in 2022, so it's been about 2.5 years of shooting this weekly at first, and then bi-weekly, as weekly, frankly, was just too time-consuming. There's been lots and lots of releases from big brands, indies, and in between, plenty of opinions, mostly from me, and maybe even a few laughs along the way. I can hope. It's been a fun ride so far, and I want to thank you for watching, leaving great comments, and making it all worthwhile. Seriously, I don't do this because I like being on camera, which I truly don't, but I do like making good content for good people. So thanks again, not just from me, but the team and I really do appreciate it. Now, before getting to the meat of this episode, I do have one bittersweet announcement regarding A Week in Watches that I need to make. With episode 100 as a milestone, turning point, if you will, we're going to be making a change to the frequency once again. We're going to be cutting it back to one episode a month. So it's not really A Week in Watches anymore, and more like a few weeks in watches, but a name change is TBD. The reason for this is because, as I said, this show is a lot of work, and frankly, I want to make other types of videos too. So by cutting back, I'll be able to shoot more in-depth reviews, guides, rants, reactions, etc. So I'll still be making videos every other week, and we'll just catch up on the news at the end of the month. Which frankly makes sense to me. That way I'll be able to focus on really the best of the best. And finally, it's episode 100. And that means we had to do something a little different and a little special. So we reached out to the Worn and Wound Plus Slack community, which, by the way, is free to join. Just hit the link in the description below, as well as on Instagram for questions, for me, your host, Zach Weiss. A sort of AMA, if you will, about my 14 years of experience in the industry, my opinions on this, that, and the other thing. Should be a good time. And also, it'll be off script, so I have no idea what I'm going to say. I'm going to try and be short and pithy with my answers, but I do have a tendency to go on. Regardless, thanks to everyone who submitted, and I'll say I'm sorry ahead of time if I don't get to your question. This episode is brought to you by the Wind Up Watch Shop. New to the shop is actually Worn and Wound's latest limited edition, the third collaboration with Nevada Grenchen. This 36mm Mecha Quartz Datomaster features a unique layout in green and teal with just a hint of purple. Limited to 150 units, they are priced at $4.99 and are available to pre-order now for delivery this summer. If you like our content here, as well as on wornandwound.com, you can support us by picking something up in our shop. Okay, let's do this. Question 1 from Alan Sokol. Where is the watch industry heading in the next 10 years, and what's the next frontier? Well, first off, if I could answer that, I'd probably be quite rich, because being able to predict the future is always, good for that kind of thing. I feel like we've been seeing a shift up market from all companies, from the most affordable, previously Microbrand, up to the most expensive luxury brand, and that is reflective of really an increase in price of the cost of goods and manufacturing. And what I think that might end up doing is actually leaving a new opening for maybe another generation of affordable brands. What those brands might look like, how they might approach making watches such that they are more affordable, I can't say. That's sort of where the magic might happen. Maybe we'll see a shift back towards quartz or back towards digital or something entirely different altogether. In terms of maybe more specific things, we've started to see microbrands and indie brands start to work on their own complications, and I think that's going to begin to expand perhaps into their own movements more, and maybe we'll even see some collaboration between these companies to start making new movement manufacturers, which I think would be really, really fascinating and frankly a great opportunity, because then these brands could further pull away from the larger institutions, the Solitas, the ETAs, et cetera, where they're competing more with large brands for, the same stock, the same, manufacturing time. So I think there's a lot of potential there. We'll see if that actually happens. Question 2 from Joshua Friedman. If you could pick one watch that's popular right now, but you predict in 10 years will seem like a passing trend, what would you pick and why? I think you're gonna get me into some trouble here, Josh, but my guess would be maybe the Mad Ones. This project by MB&F that started as a sort of affordable trinket, a clever design for supporters of the MB&F brand, which obviously makes, if you're aware of the brand, six-figure watches, extremely hard to get watches, and really wild, fascinating watches. They tried to sort of distill a little bit of that magic into something that was, sub $3,000, sort of for fun. But you can't just do that in the watch industry and not make a lot of news and not make a lot of people jealous. So of course that then expanded out, and now we've had various series of them. Most recently being the Mad 1S, which actually Zach Kazan recently reviewed. In my personal opinion, there's a lot of hype around this watch, and I think it has more to do with how it was released and the names behind it than the watch itself. You've already seen, initially these things were going for $10K on the secondhand market. If you look in Chrono 24, they've come way down now. They're already in the 4 range, and frankly, there's a lot on there. So I feel like that hype is already moving. Will people in 10 years look back and see a watch that was an inverted movement, that was sort of like a fun fidget spinner kind of thing that aesthetically is, I don't know, a strange spaceship trinket type thing as the ultimate watch of the time? I'm not sure. It might just be seen as sort of a weird bubble of the moment. That said, it's an interesting bubble of the moment. Everything I just said sort of very much defines this bubble of enthusiasm we were in post-COVID. So, it's still an interesting time capsule. Question 3 from Sebastian A. How has your interest in major brands, i.e. Rolex, Omega, AP, changed the longer you've worked in the industry? Well, that's another one that might get me in trouble. I'll say that I've kind of become just less interested in them. Not to say I'm not interested in them entirely, but I'm a little less wowed by what these brands do. I see their releases every year as being fairly iterative. The hype around the brand sometimes is feeling a little bit forced and even something sort of predictable, like people need to buy into these big brand names just to sort of be a part of a scene. The products they still make are fantastic. Like Rolex makes, probably one of the best industrialized watches, period. Not one of, they likely are. Similar with Omega. But on a personal level, I just don't get, I don't feel the wow factor very much anymore. And I don't personally feel like I really want to go out and get these watches. Obviously, there's a lot of really big brands out there. We're not mentioning all the, if you think of Richemont and LVMH and Swatch Group brands, it's just sort of similar. And if I could push them all to do something, it would just to maybe be a little bit less bottom line focused, which of course they're never not going to be, and more experimental. I think it's when sometimes these brands flex their R&D muscles that things are cool. I think about several years ago, Zenith doing the Defy Lab with that silicon oscillator, which didn't really go anywhere, but there was this moment where they were like, look, we invested in a future technology of what a watch could be, and we're actually going to produce some of them. And that was big companies doing something really cool. I want to see more of that, and less, oh look, a new ceramic bezel color, everyone go crazy. Just doesn't interest me. Actually, it's interesting. AP just this week, who not a brand that I'm personally obsessed with, like some people are, but they just released a new perpetual calendar, and they have a new mechanism for how you set that perpetual calendar by pulling the crown in and out. That kind of thing is very cool to me. So I like seeing that because maybe that'll trickle down in some way. Question 4, Chris, aka Small Watch, says, I'd be curious to hear how your personal approach to collecting has changed over the years, through natural taste progression, your exposure to the industry, etc. I mean, it's changed quite a bit. And I think when I first got into this, it started with just a desire to try everything, experience as much as I could, from styles of watches to brands to sizes, you name it. But at the same time, it was also really, really limited by what I could afford. So, for years and years and years, I wasn't buying, any watch over $1,000, and any watch I bought, I really, had to rotate my collection to get there. So, that was sort of the limiting factor for a while. like a lot of other people in the kind of COVID bubble, things sort of changed. Buying things online, obviously there was a lot more pressure sometimes because of the limited edition like hype thing that happened. So that sort of changed the nature of buying these watches. There suddenly was pressure, and at the same time, just my ability to kind of go a little up market started happening. So at that point, it became a little bit different. And what I'll say is that now where I'm at is, well, I'll say every watch I purchase is probably still impulsive in the end of the day. I like to think I'm being a little bit more conscious about it, and I'm looking for still like new experiences, but really ones that are singular and, you know, where that watch itself is quite distinctive to what it is kind of unrepeated or unrepeatable. The watches I'm keeping now are watches that I frankly like will have a hard time finding again if I ever do want one. Which is frustrating because then I can't flip my collection around very much. But, you know, basically what that's doing is pushing me towards a certain segment of the industry that's more independent and really, you know, focused on, you know, like I said, these brands that are putting craft into their watches and more experimentation. So, you know, brands like Habring, Ming, Garrick, those are the brands that I'm really kind of fascinated in right now. And, you know, for the foreseeable future, I think where my collecting is going to be focused. Question 5, and this is sort of a quick follow-up to that one from Steve Fiello. Now that you have a Lange, do you see your interest continuing to go up market, or do you think you've topped out? I sincerely hope I've topped out. I mean, there's always something more expensive that is fascinating, but you know, the Lange was really a milestone piece. I had to move a lot of watches to get there. Like I just said, I really don't have the watches to move anymore, and I'm not putting in that much more cash at this point. And the Lange does sort of represent a pinnacle of a type of watch for me. The materials, the craft that goes into it. It's also the fact that it is, it is a Richemont brand, so it is part of a large group. You know, I think from there, I would rather step back and, like I said, go for more of those independent brands that are really, you know, making watches out of like a love of making watches and experimenting more, and you know, you can meet the owners of, and yeah, that's just more where my heart lies. But moreover, I just need to pump the brakes. Okay, question 6 is from Sean Martin. It is, what is the biggest change you've seen in microbrand companies and/or their watches since you've been in the industry? This one is actually kind of easy for me. I think I've even said this a handful of times on the podcast, perhaps. It's quality. The quality of the watches that microbrands, small independents make now is extremely high. I think it's high as that they can be for the prices that they're charging. You know, at a certain point, there's just like a limit that you're going to hit in terms of finishing and things of that nature. You know, when we first got into this, I feel like microbrand was maybe used a little bit more as in a derogatory way. You could sort of tell the difference between a microbrand watch and a large production watch. You know, like they just weren't quite the same in fit, finish, and the little things, even the movements, the way they felt. They just weren't quite there. But now 100%, really almost all of the microbrand watches that we look at, that you can see at the Wind Up Watch Fair, they are 100% head-to-head with watches from large brands. I think many times they surpass them. A brand that comes to mind often in this way is Christopher Ward, but you call them a microbrand or independent, whatever. They're a fairly large company at this point. The watches that they make are punching just way above their kind of price point, you know, and I think you can see that in every little aspect of that. And that's part of why they've sort of become so popular. And as a follow-up question to that from Sean Martin as well, what are you glad has changed about watches and or the community over those 14 years? I think for me, the willingness to experiment, as well as the willingness for consumers and collectors to kind of broaden their interest. You know, for a while, everything was vintage divers, vintage style chronographs. When brands did things that were more artistic, a little bit more avant-garde, a little weird, they just didn't quite hit. And I feel like people didn't want that. People weren't open to designy watches quite yet. And now, the brands that we're seeing, Anoma, you know, with the Echo Neutra last year, with the Serica, these shaped watches, stone dials, it's a whole different language that I really think just did not fly a handful of years ago. And I think there's two sides to that. Obviously, it's risks for brands to make them, but also the consumers wanting them. And it's exciting to me because the more the collectors are willing to buy these things, frankly, the more experimental brands can be. And the more experimental they can be, the more interesting design gets and the more unique it gets as well. And like, I think in the whole sort of vintage craze, the one thing we didn't really see was really unique design. We saw really beautiful design and a lot of reinterpretation of great design, but it's taken a while to get to a point where, brands are really coming up with their own thing. And that's, from a design perspective, what's most important to me. 7, Roberto Machoro asks, what advice would you give newcomers to collecting? Take your time, don't feel pressured by either other collectors or by brands, and learn what you like organically. You don't need to try every Speedmaster, every sub or whatever. Try, just dabble, but buy what's attractive to you, and really, ignore everything else. But moreover, just the watches are there. They're not going anywhere. Something if I could recommend to myself back in the day was like, you don't need to buy this watch now. You can buy it in 2 or 3 years, probably for less, and enjoy it at that point. No rush. Okay, this one's not watch related. Question 8 from Mike J. Best concert you have ever been to? My first like big concert I ever went to was one of the best I've ever gone to as well. And that was seeing Radiohead at Radio City Music Hall in 1997 on their OK Computer tour. I don't think I'd even be able to get Radiohead tickets at this point should they go touring again. And we had decent seats at a great arena, which is also Radio City Music Hall is like small enough too that you can actually like see the band. And it was just exceptional. And I feel like that concert put me on a trajectory towards going to concerts for the rest of my life, as I still try to do. I try to go to a handful of concerts every year. For those of you who know me, I'm into metal these days. So if you're looking for answers for that, back in high school, I did get to see like Opeth and Amon Amarth at L'Amour's, which was a tiny club out in Bay Ridge, which if my parents had known I was going to, they would have freaked out. And those were exceptional. Seeing these bands that now play stadiums in like, basically a large bar was absolutely incredible. Okay, from Paddles, Watches, and Grinds, what watch have you sold that you most regret getting rid of? I have 2 answers here. One is the Hamilton Intramatic from, like 1969, 1970 that I got years ago. I actually got it right as I left the last job I had before going on to be at Worn & Wound full time. It's a super cool watch with the caliber 11 movement in it. It's tiny and beautiful and rare, and I got it for an insanely good price. I'll never see it for that price. It was like a little over $1,000. I eventually had to liquidate a bunch of my collection at some point for, financial purposes as it happens. And now I don't want to buy one again for like $6K. It just doesn't feel right. So that one I miss. It was a very cool watch. The other one, live and learn, but my dad had given me one of his watches a long time ago. It was a Louis Erard regulator. In my frenetic trading and everything, I did end up selling that. I feel bad. Obviously, my father has passed away, so there was an emotional reason there. And I just am, upset that I did that. It was a cool watch. I wasn't wearing it a ton because it was a little big, but I did like it quite a bit. And it was just a stupid thing for me to have done. Dr. Roberto Lozano asks, what's your take on a good size of a watch collection? I mean, there's no right answer to this. One approach could be to just try not to have more watches than you can wear. Sometimes I've run into this where I love the watches I have, but I end up not wearing a watch for several months because I kind of forgot about it, and that doesn't really feel right. Like, what's the point of having it at that point? Similarly, don't have more watches than you can afford. But, reality, just have as many as you want. You only live once, so what does it matter? All right, and I might make this the last question of the episode from Jared Hills. What is keeping America from being a recognized watch producer on a large scale? What would need to happen, in your opinion, for a company to really make a dent? So that's a really big question. Several years ago, there was a much larger movement, I would say, or push for American-made watches, and that got sort of cut off. Not sort of, it did get cut off by a change in the FTC rules for what makes a watch American made, like to actually say, like Swiss made on a dial, to say American made on a dial. And the ruling paraphrase is basically that everything needs to be made in America. And that is not a realistic expectation. I think it's really naive. It's not reflective of how other countries do this. So for example, Swiss made, for a watch to say Swiss made on it, 60% of the value of the watch has to come from within Switzerland. The watch has to be engineered in Switzerland, has to be assembled in Switzerland, maybe quality controlled in Switzerland. And there's, like finer points within there, but 60% versus 100% is a massive difference. And when you look at this industry and you look at what goes into making a watch, all of the components, all of the expertise that goes into it, to suddenly start it up again, is just such a massive investment, both in time and skill and education, that without a ton of money or a ton of time, or, and I'll get to in a minute what a couple of brands have done, which is just be extremely small scale, you can't really do it. So I think what that's done is really shot the idea of American-made watches in the foot by just making it too hard. So like, what's the point of doing 50% here and going through the trouble of doing that, which it's not easy to do. You'd have to train people to make the dials, the hands, etc. Just really, you'll have to build up a lot of your own infrastructure just to not be able to use the label. Brands that are worth mentioning here, though, that have been working really hard. So Jan Shapiro out in California, they make very, very high-end watches, and they do have what they're calling an American-made movement in a watch that I believe is, between like $80,000 and $100,000. I didn't look that up right before this, but it is a very expensive watch because it's, it's handmade in a traditional way. And so that's the kind of watch that maybe can get around these rulings. There's also Keaton Myrick, who is in the Pacific Northwest, who I've never even seen one of his watches in person. He's making them in extremely, extremely small quantities. But, in a more approachable arena, there's RGM in Pennsylvania. They were, probably the first that's famous, and everyone refers to them because they have movements that until this ruling were called American made, and now they're just largely American made, but they use components from elsewhere as well. Vortic/Colorado watch. Vortic calls themselves American made because they use old movements back from when watches were made in America. The industry was once here and it did leave. And then Colorado watch, I believe they say 80% American made, which is a cool claim for them to make. They use movements from FTS in Arizona, who make the AmeriQuartz movements and the Americron movements. These are American assembled. They have a large amount of components made in America, but they don't qualify under these rules as a fully American made. So, that's kind of where the industry has gone. Until that FTC rule changes, or a billionaire just wants a fun side project, I don't see American made being a big thing in the watch industry. And that's unfortunate, but it certainly doesn't stop American brands from making watches. So don't let it hold you back. And with that, I think I'm going to wrap up episode 100 of A Week in Watches. Once again, 2.5 years of doing this. It's been a lot of fun. Thanks again for watching. Please read Worn and Wound if you're looking for more great watch content, and like and subscribe if you wouldn't mind. I'm Zach Weiss, and I'll see you soon.